Our reading today is from Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, a physician, professor, and author. She says, "Everybody has a story. When I was a child, people sat around kitchen tables and told their stories. We don't do that so much anymore. Sitting around the table telling stories is not just a way of passing time. It's the way that wisdom gets passed along. The stuff that helps us to live a life worth remembering." You may have noticed that every good comic book hero, villain, or religious figure needs an origin story so that the audience can better understand their motivations and what's at stake for them as their storylines move forward. My mother used to curl up in bed with me at 1:30 in the morning on December 21st each year and tell me the story of my birth. "Once upon a time," she'd begin, before explaining how her labor had caused the OB to miss part of the annual Christmas party, and therefore he was an insufferable jerk throughout the process. She'd say how she'd surmised he was a little tipsy as he passed me over to her, knowing how she'd felt holding me for the first time, knowing I would change things for her. And how my father sang, "Isn't she lovely?" in the background, which was apparently annoying, but in an adorable kind of way. And after a few minutes, she'd end by telling me how cold it was that winter and how we'd spent all season wrapped together like two koalas clinging to one another, trying to keep warm. So special was this ritual to us, she continued it an additional time or two after I moved away to college, calling me on the phone this time, until finally she slept through it one year. After some good-natured guilting on my part, we wordlessly put it to bed. It's no white elephant birthed under a bow tree, spoken in full sentences with blooming lotuses origin story like the Buddha's, but it's mine. And as everyday mundane as it might be, it is powerful for me because, among other things, it reinforces the foundation of my relationship with my parents. We all have stories like the one I just shared, and I'd wager a million more. I think about the stories of your life, of your first love, of your childhood or adolescence, that one time you skinned your knees when the brakes on your bike gave out, or that Christmas you got the one thing you'd been most desperate to receive, the time you felt certain you would die but somehow lived, or when you first noticed the night sky and understood what it meant to feel awe. Our bodies are walking, talking, eating, thinking, singing anthologies of stories. Each day, each experience we have, we add new pages to our existing narratives, or write new ones altogether. We create these stories as a way to understand ourselves, others, and how we fit into the world around us. And after a while, these stories of us become us. Often the language of our story comes from someone else, whether through compliments or insults. After a while, we learn the language and it becomes a story we tell ourselves. Sometimes these stories are brief and on the outside appear simple, like, "I am smart," or "I am bad." And other times they are long and nuanced, like the story of my own birth. Either way, our identities can easily become entangled in them. After all, it's been said that sometimes we need a story more than food in order to live. I think that because of our deep connection to storytelling as humans, it was a way of survival, really. It's easy to begin believing them, no matter the content, when they're so crucial to our lives. So imagine then if these stories we tell ourselves or others are made of half-truths or misperceptions or straight-out lies. They seem true to us, even if they're not the full, real story. I'm sure those of you with siblings can remember a story from your childhood that seems so vivid and real, but when you tell your siblings, they say, "That never happened," or "That is totally wrong. Let me tell you what really happened." When you've been misremembering them or telling it wrong for so many years, it becomes an unshakable personal truth, like your own mythology or folklore, repeated into certainty. Like the other stories we tell, don't these stories then become a part of us too? And our foundations and identities are then built upon falsehoods. I went on a routine visit while working at the hospital last month, assuming I was headed into nothing more than an initial consult with the mother of a young adult patient. I was surprised to end up in a 2-hour discussion with her. After an invitation to pleasantly debate scriptural interpretation, which is almost always a trap, I listened to her reaction to the latest political news, updates from the physicians working with her son, and sharing some fantastical conspiracy theories, and providing emotional support. She surprised me with a new topic. You know what I've really been enjoying lately? She started with. All these stories of white folks who do that 23andMe DNA kit and are startled to realize they've got some African in them. And you know half of them are still going to be racist jerks despite the results right there in their hands. We laughed, half in sadness and half in helplessness perhaps, and turned to a new topic before finally sharing hugs and parting ways. But you know, I've been thinking about that conversation and the truth of it for over a month now. How often do we encounter a truth about ourselves, one that is in stark contrast with how we see ourselves and the world around us, a truth too difficult to acknowledge, so we simply ignore it, or we go out of our way to attempt to disprove it. As I mentioned during the welcome this morning, transitioning from our old ways of thinking, especially when they become so much a part of how we see and understand ourselves, requires some humility. We have to be able to say, I was wrong. And man, are there 3 more difficult words in the English language than I was wrong. I mean, when we've spent our whole lives believing we have 30% Cherokee in us, because that's what our grandmother always told us, and we believed it, and it influenced how we thought of ourselves, how we practiced our religion, how we voted, and on and on. What a big deal it is to open that letter and realize we have 0.1% Cherokee and 99.9% Czechoslovakian. And reflecting upon this, I'm thinking the same can be said of religious stories. Long ago, when we did not have the technology or scientific theory to understand how the universe worked, when we still believed that the flat earth was the center of the galaxy, we had religious stories depicting our origins and explaining the origins of our world. As our knowledge has increased, the truth about our world has bumped up against our previously held beliefs. Pythagoras, Magellan, Darwin, Lemaitre, these philosophers and scientists caused significant disruption to how humanity has always understood our world through a religious lens. Their findings, of course, inspired both awe and disgust. And despite the hundreds, if not thousands of years that have passed since their discoveries, there are those that would still deny them. There are still flat earthers who exist, people. We had a neighbor growing up who, in dutifully following his faith tradition's belief, held firm to the idea that the earth was 6,000 years old, despite the undeniable evidence to the contrary. At some point in that faith tradition's history, there came a moment when the proven fact rubbed up against the evidence. And in that moment, it was decided that their believed fact, that the earth was 6,000 years old, was too important to their identities to let go. And in fact, the decision to deny that the earth was 4 billion years old became a new part of their identity, rather than just being humble enough to accept the proven fact as part of their new identity. But stories are powerful. Whole swaths of humanity have been created and destroyed by them, by rumors, by mythologies. A small example would be the Salem witch trials, or the Heaven's Gate cult. Whole religions were created from stories. All the world's religions have a central, compelling one, and it has to be big and meaningful for others to follow it. So it blossoms up, fills more and more with meaning and emotion, the more fantastical, the better. Whether it's Jesus' life and death, the Buddha's journey towards nirvana, or the supposed foreshadowing of Muhammad, we are surrounded by religious narratives. And this makes sense, as most of these religions began in a time when few could read or write. And so story was the most useful form of gathering information. As Dr. Remen pointed out in our reading, stories were crucial in passing down wisdom from one generation to the next. They were also much more fun than, say, presenting a series of facts and statistics on why Jesus could or could not have arisen. So what of our faith's story? Unitarian Universalism has a long, powerful legacy. We have a story rich with intellectual greatness, plush with artistic expression, overflowing with leadership and support of progressive values, and more nurturing of emotional depths. This is how we have long viewed ourselves. But over the last decade, there has been a reckoning for us too. Whether it was the same sexism and racism that haunt all imperfect human institutions, or the more UU-specific failings, our humanist theist debates, and our classism, we have come to acknowledge the ways in which we are flawed. And more importantly, we have begun to address them, changing our hearts and changing our narrative. And as painful as this can be, it is possible because I think in order to be a UU, you must have a certain degree of humility built in to begin with. In order to enter a movement that proclaims it does not have all the answers, welcomes skeptics, and appreciates truths from all walks of life and all faith traditions, you must be willing to accept you will be wrong from time to time, that we will be wrong from time to time. Really, what you're doing when you accept this is making your foundation, the way you see yourself, earthquake-proof. That way, when you begin to build your story, should some of it rub up against a difference of opinion or differing facts, your identity doesn't crumble to the ground. Rather, it shifts and reorganizes. I like to say that being a UU minister is excellent job security. Whether that's in reality or just theoretically, that's supposed to, we'll find out, I guess, in the future. But after all, should I have some terrific change of heart and find myself leaning towards a different theology, I will still be welcome as a Christian UU, or a Buddhist UU, or a Sufi, or pagan, or atheist UU. Being a UU means your theology is largely earthquake-proof. If repetition of pleasant stories like birth are powerful enough to help shape us into who we are, no wonder traumas, which we often tell the stories of over and over again as a way towards healing, become a part of how we view ourselves. Victim, survivor, perpetrator, witness, these become our identities, even if for only a little while. Most chaplains and many therapists believe in the healing power of story editing. This is the idea that a person can change their own traumatic or painful story into something empowering or restorative by slightly altering it. Not necessarily creating untruths, just changing perspectives. It can help one to take back control over their own story, creating their own meaning and way forward. And this particular strategy was initially discovered by psychologist and professor Tim Wilson. He stumbled on the technique back in the early 1980s when he found that a revised story helped college students who were struggling academically. "I'm bad at school" was the old story many of them were telling themselves. That story leads to a self-defeating cycle that keeps them struggling, Wilson says. The new story he gave them was, everyone fails at first. He introduced them to this idea by having them read accounts from other students who had struggled with grades at first, and then improved. It was a 40-minute intervention that had effects 3 years later, he found. The ones who got our little story editing nudge improved their grades, whereas the others didn't, Wilson said. And to our surprise, those who got our story editing intervention were more likely to stay in college. The people in the control group were more likely to drop out. This is, alongside a faith that pushes you to be earthquake-proof, a tool for those whose believed truth have rubbed up against the proven truth. A way to edit their stories in a way that will give the believed truth new meaning by incorporating the proven truth. Like, I thought I was unworthy of love, but that's because I didn't know how to love myself. And now I know I'm worthy of love. Or, if you're like my neighbor and are prone to biblical literalism, you might edit your story to say, I thought the earth was 6,000 years old because I wasn't ready to acknowledge what it would mean to my faith if it was older. Now I understand God's plan is beyond humanity's understanding. So I am asking you, what stories are you holding on to that need to be updated or revised? In what ways have you learned to earthquake-proof your foundation? And how will you go forward in your faith to earthquake yourself? Amen.